everybody. Welcome to another edition of Live with Josie. We're going to be talking about building inclusive, high-performing teams within engineering. I am so excited to be here today with all of you. So last week I talked a little bit about positive intelligence and how we can use it to achieve our true potential and that of our teams. So be sure to check that out if you didn't have a chance to tune in last week. And I want to first get started in case those of you who haven't tuned in before and want to learn a little bit more about the show and about myself. I'll be hosting Live with Josie every Wednesday at 5 p.m. PST. So be sure to tune in and add it to your calendar. And I'm an executive coach for engineering leaders focused on building inclusive, high-performing teams. My mission is to empower engineering leaders with the empathetic management practices and inclusive culture building so that they can not only retain their top talent, but also build happier, more motivated teams that truly build the products that we need to fulfill our diverse world. And so my mission is really around retaining women in tech. I want to change the statistic that 56% of women leave the tech industry after 10 to 20 years. And how I want to change that is by working with engineering leaders, both men and women, in building these inclusive and diverse teams that truly thrive. Because, the main reason women are leaving the workforce is actually inequity. And it turns out that 37% of the tech workforce is leaving every year due to that unfairness. So that's something that we as engineering leaders can really make a difference and change. And we can be creating a better world, not just for our teams, but for everybody out there as well. And so, I realized one of the practices that I start all of my coaching meetings with is celebrating wins. I truly believe that as leaders, we should be celebrating those. And so I realized I should be celebrating wins as part of my LinkedIn Lives. So part of my series at the beginning, we'll be sharing some of my wins for the week as well before I hop into some of the industry news and my topic for the week. So this week, what are some of the wins that I'm celebrating? Well, I have gotten a couple of clients, which is exciting, but what I'm really excited about is I just wrapped up 7 weeks of training on positive intelligence, which I was talking about last week. And I'm now signed up to be a positive intelligence coach, and I'm going to be getting my certification, which also means that I can offer my clients access to the positive intelligence training as well, along with coaching, which I think is really impactful for those habit changes that we want. And I'm also going to be starting a coaching training program with my old executive coach, Tony Collis, to really learn about how to really be coaching effectively with a focus on trauma-informed leadership, and which is definitely an area I'm more excited to learn about. And so those are some of my wins for the week. I'd love to hear anybody else's wins, so feel free to share in the comments if you'd like, or just say hi in the comments. I'd love to hear if anybody's listening in, or if you're watching on replay, be sure to leave a comment as well about things that you enjoyed. So, today in industry news, I, was reading an article, and I think right now my LinkedIn feed every day is full of what it feels like yet another layoff announcement, which is really sad, right? But this is something I talked about too, and this article was mentioning the same thing, which is, hey, now that hiring has slowed down, this is the perfect opportunity for companies to be improving their hiring practices. It's now is the time to start building those pipelines and partnering with those communities, for underrepresented minorities. When hiring is really fast, and picking up, and people are in the middle of growth, I constantly hear, oh, but Jossie, I don't have time right now to slow down and make sure I'm partnering with communities and building this inclusive hiring process and all of these things. Well, guess what? Now's the time to do it. You have the bandwidth right now, right? And one of the most important things you can be doing is creating an inclusive culture so that when you do reopen hiring and you start getting more women and underrepresented minorities in your teams, that they actually can thrive in the culture that your team has. And if you've listened to me for a while, I always love throwing around numbers and statistics behind all the things I'm talking about. And here's one that was really sobering to me. A recent survey conducted by Carrot reveals that only 48% of engineering leaders agree with the statement that DEI is a strategic priority for their company. So, and how is this the case in 2020, when the unfortunate events of George Floyd's murder happened? So many companies in the tech industry posted these lovely, oh, hey, we're really going to be supporting diversity and inclusion now. We're going to make a difference. And where are those initiatives? What has actually changed in the last 2 years, right? And unfortunately, and the reason I want to talk about this is the DEI budgets, those tend to be the first to go when companies experience market turbulence. But we can't be doing that now because we're not going to be retaining our talent. And so that nicely leads to the topic for today, which is empathy. And so I truly believe that empathy is the foundation we need to be leading with every day if we want to be creating more inclusive and diverse teams, and we want to create technology that actually addresses the needs of our diverse world. And, I've mentioned this, I think, before a few times, but what do I mean by that? What do I mean by products that actually fulfill the needs of our diverse world? Well, let me go through some examples of things that haven't fulfilled these needs. Well, when Apple's Health Kit was first released, it didn't include support for periods and menstruation cycles. That kind of takes out half the population. When Google image search used to confuse gorillas and Black men. And there's a ton of bias and so much underlying machine learning data that is being used for so many tools. And so this is what I mean. I want to be building products that are inclusive. And the thing is, some companies are doing it, and it's amazing seeing companies really think about product development from that inclusive lens. And I truly believe that by engineering with empathy, we can be doing our part to be creating inclusivity in our organizations and finally start moving the needle. So I've talked about empathy and I've mentioned empathy, but I first want to start with the definition of empathy. And my favorite definition of empathy comes from Brene Brown, who's a shame and vulnerability researcher. And she really defines empathy as being made up of 4 components. The first one is seeing the world as others see it. And I think as engineers, there's 2 sides to this. First, it's really seeing the world through the eyes of all of our potential customers, right? And really understanding, how can we make this product inclusive of everybody who might be using it? And then the second one is seeing the world through the eyes of our coworkers and having this belief, and start with trust that, hey, we are all here together to build an amazing product, and that's our real goal and intent for showing up every day. And so no matter anybody's background, we really are able to see things through their world. The second one is about being non-judgmental, and unfortunately, I think there's a little bit of a culture of blame sometimes that I see within engineering. I mean, for example, when something goes wrong and code breaks, what's the first command an engineer usually runs? Git blame, to see who committed the offending line of code. So that runs counter, though, to creating a culture of empathy. And so, what if instead we treated problems with curiosity, and going back to that underlying belief that our colleagues are doing their best? So, instead of starting with blame, it's about communicating with empathy and seeing why did they maybe implement something or do something the way they did. The third component of empathy is really understanding another person's feelings. And this is really about being able to take the time to reflect on how your actions and words really impact both your colleagues and the customers, and really taking the time to actively listen. I feel like so many times, and I definitely have done this too, it's you start answering somebody's question in your head before they've even finished. And how are you going to understand how they're feeling if you haven't even listened to them fully? And then there's the fourth component of empathy, which I think actually may be the most important one. And that is being able to reflect another person's feelings back to them. And this step is also the one I see missed most often when it comes to empathy. And so if you can master this step, it will empower you to have difficult conversations, effectively deliver difficult feedback, impact change, and influence others. Because so often arguments happen literally because one side doesn't feel heard or acknowledged. So, and this also goes back to that, hey, why don't we always do yes and instead of no but when it comes to having a conversation? And also assuming, hey, even if we disagree, there's 10% right in that other thing. So how do we really stop judging and really take the time to ensure you're truly reflecting that other person's opinions back to them first before you give your ideas and opinions? And so now that I've gone through kind of the definition of empathy, let's talk about empathy and leadership. 70% of the global workforce says that with everything that happened with COVID-19, that the past year was actually the most stressful year of their lives. And so if we don't take the time to lead with empathy, the rest of the skills we use don't matter. And so as leaders, where can we apply empathy, right? Well, first, it's about making sure we're making space for colleagues to share how they are struggling. At this point, human connection is crucial. And yet, with virtual and remote, especially, we've lost those touch points sometimes. We don't have potentially the water cooler where we have casual conversations. So as leaders, we need to be intentionally making space to ensure that human connection is happening. Another approach for leaders is, going back to what I was saying about active listening, right? It's about truly listening to your employees and reflecting back what you hear from them before diving in and having an opinion and solution. You know, when you have empathy, this is going to help you because your ability to be more empathetic will lead to trust because it's going to create a space where people are going to be willing to be vulnerable. But it actually starts with you being vulnerable as well. And I mentioned our customers earlier, and as leaders, we're the ones guiding these solutions and create and solving these problems. So we need to make sure that we're having empathy for our customers and our team members and our peers to make sure we're building these great products. It's about accepting one another for who we are, right? It's going back and believing that everybody's worth and capability and allowing everybody to truly be human. That means people can make mistakes, but we can still hold each other accountable for our behaviors, right? Being empathetic does not mean you can't hold somebody accountable. And finally, what I wanted to touch on is empathy actually starts with self-awareness and self-empathy. When we can really be more in touch with our own emotions and are able to read others' feelings, that makes us be more able to read others' feelings. And if we don't start with like that self-empathy, it can actually feel really draining to hold space for others potentially. But I've also, people tell me like, Jossie, I have a million and one things on my to-do list. Isn't focusing on self-care and self-empathy selfish? And I'm like, no, it's just like when on the airlines they say, hey, put on your oxygen mask before you put on those of others. It's really the same thing as a leader. If you're not taking the time to be empathetic with yourself, you can't truly be empathetic with others as well. And I've referenced a couple times empathy within engineering. And I really want to talk about how we can apply empathy to engineering and dive a little bit into a topic I've mentioned in the past, which is empathy in code reviews. So first, engineering is a lot of our role is coding, right? If we're a first-line software engineer. And coding is actually a form of communication if you think about it. And effective communication, as I referenced earlier, is rooted in empathy. And so how can we be applying empathy in engineering? Well, first, where it encourages us to have maintainable and flexible code, because that means we have empathy for ourselves when we need to go fix a bug. We want to have the code be maintainable. Empathy for our future colleagues who might have to go in and fix something that was broken previously. Having empathy in engineering means thinking about dependency management. You might be like, Jossie, what does empathy have to do with dependency management? Well, some of you may have seen the story about Uber being hacked recently, right? And then they went and hired a bunch of, or have a lot of openings for security engineers now. And this ties back to empathy because security is about having empathy for your customers and wanting to make sure you're creating potentially, or one area of dependency management is making sure that site is secure and that you have security for your customers' data and privacy, because that's part of what you're holding, right? You're holding their data, and by not caring about dependency management and potentially introducing vulnerabilities into the code, that's actually making your product less safe. And that is actually directly tied to empathy for your customers. And another way we can be applying empathy in engineering is by avoiding dangerous assumptions, right? Sometimes it's important to either be embracing a beginner's mindset to really think through where all the gotchas may be, or really slow down our thinking in places where bias can potentially come in. And so that is such an important part of engineering as well. And, ultimately, empathy will allow us to influence others more effectively and motivate them. And as engineers, we're doing this all the time, right? We don't work in little silos. And so I specifically wanted to dive into the example of empathy in code reviews, just to give you a really tactical example of one way to apply empathy. And so I wanted to start with the fact that pull requests are really not about finding, how many bugs or issues are in somebody else's code. It's actually about collaboration and creating a good coding practice. And that is the attitude to have when you think about empathy in code reviews. So first, let's talk about it from the perspective of the person who wrote the code. When you are the person writing the code, you are about to create that pull request, and you've usually just finished up your project, you want to get it out the door, and you're ready for that next thing, right? And however, the people who are about to do your code review, you need to have empathy for them because they may not have gone through that same journey with you, right? And so you need to make sure that you're taking their perspective into account. The other person's and so that's one thing to consider. And so how can you provide them, architecture documents, product specs, all the information they need? What are some of the gotchas in the code potentially, right? Next is, the person who's going to be doing the review needs to have some empathy for the person writing who wrote the code, right? And starting it with an assumption, right? Like I was mentioning earlier, let's assume that our colleagues are capable and that there is a reason that they must have done everything that they did. And let's focus from the place of, hey, instead of criticizing, let's be curious. And one of the things I've seen is so many times I see PR comments starting with, why did you? Or why didn't you? Now, if your partner or significant other went into your office and said to you, why didn't you do the dishes today? I'd be kind of taken back and offended. And yet, that is the tone and attitude that's coming across, unfortunately, in code reviews when you start with why did you or why didn't you, because text has a negative connotation and there's usually not. So, and a lot of times code reviews are asynchronous. So there isn't an audible or visual element that's tied to it. And we can truly reframe things and from a place of curiosity instead. So instead of, why did you leave that variable here? I don't see it used anywhere. You could reframe it to say, hey, I didn't think I saw variable X used somewhere else in the code. Could you tell me why it's needed here? That is coming at it from much more of a place of curiosity and empathy and doesn't have the other person potentially react negatively. And sometimes people will say, well, Jossie, you're just being overly sensitive. People should just get over it. And here's the thing. You're talking about human beings. If your friend was upset at you about the way that you were behaving or how you had treated them, would you be that dismissive? Would you just tell your friend, oh, I don't care? No, I would hope that, I'm assuming that you would actually try to have a conversation with them about this, right? And so why do we treat our colleagues poorly, right? Like, let's have a little bit of empathy for our colleagues. And then, hey, if code reviews are done really well, you're actually also having empathy for your future colleagues because they can then go back and read through these code reviews. And if they're really treated almost like an architectural dig, it can provide so much insight for your future colleagues about how things are being built and why. And so, I think those are just a couple of things that I had wanted to share about empathy today, and running a little over from how I expected in time. So I appreciate those of you who've been tuning in and listening. And, if you've been finding my LinkedIn Lives useful, please definitely comment and let me know. I really appreciate folks taking the time to listen in and let me know what they enjoyed. And if you're interested in learning more about executive one-on-one coaching for yourself, potentially, or group coaching on inclusive leadership for your team, or potentially any public speaking keynotes or workshops around inclusion and retaining women in tech that you might need, please be sure to reach out. And I forgot to mention earlier, but we ended up relaunching the Retaining Wit podcast this week. And so be sure to check it out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We've got 3 new episodes, so there's a lot of amazing content, and we'll be releasing new episodes every week. So thank you so much for taking the time to tune in today with Live with Jossie, and be sure to tune in next week at 5 p.m. PST for another lesson on how to build inclusive, high-performing teams in tech.